So hello everyone and welcome to our Study of Religions research seminar. Today we're delighted to have Dr. Giacomo Leoni, who is also staff in our department. Giacomo began his foray in academics in Padua, studying history writ large and then moving into history of ancient Christianity at Padua and Ca' Foscari. The question raised during his research into early Christian heretics led to a PhD in philosophy of religion at Boston University. His research spans questions of tradition and inheritance, especially in their connection to authority and violence. Although his next project will be a path towards ethical spectatorship, a collaboration with the Film and Screen Media Department at UCC. On the theoretical side, he is indebted to Gadamer, Ricoeur, and Carney, insofar as hermeneutics are concerned, while his philosophical underpinning stems from Fichte, Levinus, Marian, and the latter's conversations with Derrida. So I'll pass it over to you, Giacomo.
Thank you. So when thinking about what to present for today's seminar, I went back basically to the origins of my interest in religious studies and the study of religion. I come academically and biographically from Italy, which shares with Ireland a history of strong domination, both political and of the intellectual life of the Catholic Church. And so similarly to what has happened here in more recent years, in post-World War II Italy, everything that was connected to Catholic thinking in public university was looked at problematic and suspicious. Therefore, the historical method, which in Italy is still seen as connected to Morton Smith's article in 1968, Historical Method in the Study of Religion, has dominated the university approach far more than the anthropological or the sociological approaches that are more common in the Anglo-Saxon academic world. So when I was a student 20 years ago or so, Paolo Scarpi was the main theoretician and main professor of religious studies in Padua, was a strong devotee of this strictly historical approach. The idea was that religion should be looked at as artifacts of human construction that survive through time and analyzed exactly with the same methods in which we analyze any other historical artifact, looking for issues of truth versus falsification and issues of instrumentalization and political use of religion. This was inspired not only by the Italian tradition, but by the work of mostly Bloch and Max Müller, who in Germany and France had approached religion as part of a history of population that was not distinguishable from, say, economics or history of the military and so forth and so on. And that was also my beginning. I came to the study of religion almost by accident. My interest was in ancient Roman history. I started studying a character, Metellus Pontifex, who was an important Roman general. And then I got interested in the translation of Roman historians who focused on his religious figure. Is one of those Roman heroes that is famous for sacrificing part of himself. In the case of Metellus Pontifex, when after his career in the military he becomes the political and religious leader of Rome, he happens to be involved in a fire at the Vestal Temple, and is able to save the Vestal simulacrum, the most sacred item of the temple. But luckily, he becomes blind in the process because the sacred simulacrum can only be seen by the Vestal virgins that guard the temple. And so it's one of those typical Roman histories that usually happen in a military sphere. The Orazzi swearing to give the life up for Rome, as in Louis David famous painting. But this is translated to the religious sphere. And from that, my interest in ancient religion morphed into interest of ancient Christianity, and from there I kept on going. But this historical perspective was crucial to my approach to religion, and it informed my research into early Christianity heretics. Throughout the years, and particularly in comparing and confronting my work with that of people trained in different schools, especially in the American context, where the line between history of religion and history of religious theology is not as marked and as untouchable as it is in Europe, I have started to question whether there is such a thing as a dispassionate historical approach. A lot of my work in recent years has been dealing with why we read what we read, a process that started with my master thesis, proceeded through my PhD, and still informs my teaching even here at UCC. And so today I wanted to go back to two case studies from my early research to look at whether there is a connection between the reliability of the finished text, what the researcher produces for dissemination and for use by others, and their stated intention in terms of how involved they are with the subject matter. In a way, is the historical method, is the approach to the history of the text and the history of the writer by necessity connected to a declaration of distance from one's religious perspective, or can the two things survive together? Vice versa, is the detachment from the religious perspective a guarantee of objectivity, as we hear often proclaimed, or are the two things completely parallel and independent dimension for a researcher? Personally, I'm not particularly involved in the religions I study, but there is a certain pretense, especially in certain parts of European thinking, that one needs not to be involved in a religion to be a researcher of said religion. And so the two case studies that I will analyze today, and I'll try to be brief because this being my first research, I could also always be tempted of geeking out and going on forever, but that's not the focus per se of this seminar, is to compare two approaches that are around the middle, or let's say the first half of the 20th century, of scholars going back to heretics of the first few centuries, one with the intent and the declared intent of being strictly historical, of detaching religious participation from the analysis of the historical document, and the other, the opposite, and to highlight how both end up in unexpected places. So to start with, I would focus on von Harnack, who's an exponent of liberal approaches to the study of Christianity on the turning of the 19th into the 20th century. Von Harnack wrote significantly on the history of Christianity, and he was one of the first one in Lutheran Germany to state that not only politically state and church should be strictly separated, but that the Christian influence on the study of Christianity was to be rejected, and that the approaches that had been used for other approaches to history should be applied to the religious studies as well. He produced a large amount of works that I obviously won't go into, but I will mention two crucial works. In 1890, he writes Lehrbuch der Dogmengeschichte, a manual about the dogma of Christianity. Something he's very critical of. He sees that as the dominance of the church tradition over the analysis of the text, in particular the evangelical text. And in 1900, he writes Das Wesen des Christenmus, the essence of Christianity, a text concerned to, again, whether there is a truth whether the question of truth can be asked of Christian texts. He agrees with Ritschl, an important theoretician of the time, on the necessity to liberate the study of, in his case, the gospel from the influence of the church. And but his larger work, and the one that I focus on the most, well, not his largest, the one that I focus on the most, the one that is looms largest to me, is his work on Marcion. In a book called Marcion, Das Evangelium vom fremden Gott, which I could translate as the Gospel of the Unknown God, which he published in 1921 and then again in 1924, he analyzes philologically and historically, that's the claim that is made in the introduction, the work and life and writing of Marcion. Marcion, for those who are not versed or interested in the early Christianity and its dogmatic dynamic, is the one responsible for the creation of canon. The idea of canon that today we use for everything from religion, strictly speaking, to media, the canon of Star Wars, the canon of Marvel, etc., was at first created in a Catholic environment in the 2nd century to answer the activities of this Marcion character, who was agnostic. Marcion was, according to Hippolytus, the son of a bishop who in 144 of the Christian era had a rupture with a falling out with the Christian community in Rome. I won't go into the details of why that happened and how, but basically Marcion was proclaiming to have reconstructed, once again with scientific method, we would say, with philological methods, the real gospel, something that interestingly was then reprised by Augustine and by modern historian of religion who still today are trying to debate the exact sequence of the sources for the Christian gospel. So Marcion is doing a religious operation that uses methods that will later be used by people who are trying to approach things scientifically. He goes into an analysis in his Antithesis, is the title of his work. He goes into an analysis of how the Christian community, according to him, has manipulated the historical documents, and he insists on historical, on true, on authentic, words like this, to basically to propel their own vision of Christianity. He uses a quasi-philology, by which I mean that the methods are philological in nature, but they are applied based on a political or religious perspective. He recovers or restores passive forms over active forms, where he sees the possibility for a transcription error, and even recovers the original order of sentences, all of this to create a version of the New Testament that is completely disconnected for the Old Testament and that presents two gods rather than one. Again, I won't get into the details of Marcion's theory because that's not my focus today, but the interesting bit about Marcion is that he imagines, contrary to mainstream Christianity, that the word of the Old Testament and the story of the Old Testament testify of a God of creation that is completely separated from the God of the Christian message. So he imagines a God that he calls the demiurge for the Old Testament, that creates and judges and rules, and the God that saves for the New Testament. But what interests me is how Harnack, this supposedly historical method devotee, spends a lot of time following Theodor Zahn, another specialist of the time, improving the good faith of Martin. What does he mean by that? Von Arnack doesn't think Martin is right in any of his proclamation. Martin is trying to reconstruct what he calls St. Paul's gospel. By the way, Martin is also credited with using for the first time the word evangelium, which is Latin for gospel, for the text rather than for the message. So a big influence there too. But anyhow, Arnack doesn't think Martin is right, but he thinks Martin is in good faith. And he spends a significant amount of time explaining how Martin is in good faith. He says that Martin doesn't claim to have another text. He doesn't present this St. Paul's text. He doesn't reference visions, something that was very common in Christian debate of the time, nor does he reference a secret tradition. He doesn't say, oh, you know, another community told me this and they heard it from someone else who heard it from first-time witnesses. He is presenting his work as reconstructing the text. But the question became, at the end of my foray into Arnack, why is Arnack so interested in the good faith of Martin? Others had looked into Martin, mostly looking for the proto-gospel, the first gospel, and things like that. But it's Arnack who for all his declaration of fealty to the historical method, still falls into the trap of using Martin for a religious rather than analytical goal. So while von Arnack, much like Martin's methods are strictly historical, he goes into very long and somewhat boring analysis of the morphology of the text in the antithesis and the mistakes that Martin does in connecting one form to a supposed original form. But he still sees Martin as anti-syncretic versus the great church, the rejection of the gnoseological influence, and therefore worthy of study. The moral justification of Martin becomes as crucial to von Arnack as his historical accuracy, to the point that, and here I was looking for the quote, but I cannot find it, but I have it if anyone is interested. He ends up comparing Martin to Luther, and therefore disclosing that his historical approach, this dispassionate analysis, is still guided by his belief in a certain role of truth and simplicity and veracity of the New Testament in his own Lutheran faith. So while the declaration is of historical nature, he fails in a way to detach his own belief from the historical method. So he undergoes the process and the requirements of declaring that he's doing something completely detached from his faith. But in my humble opinion, he fails at that. The opposite happens with a group of Catholic theologians, in the Nouvelle Théologie or ressourcement theology, as it's usually called in English, that look at Origen in the middle of the 20th century. Here we have the exact opposite approach. Some of these are priests, others are theologians active. One of them is a cardinal. They are looking at Origen to look for answers to the Catholic debate of the time. They are basically moved by Pio XII Humani Generis, an encyclica that condemns certain parts of Christian thought. I won't get into the detail, but so here we have a text that is built with the declaration of the faith and of the religious views of the proponents in first prima facie, in the first place and very clearly. And so one would expect this kind of text to basically be of theological nature, and they certainly have some parts of theological nature. But referring to Bloch again, referring to Voegelin and Herder and people like that, they actually end up being more historical than the obsession with historicity inspired documents that characterize the first half or the early part of the 20th century. In particular, I will focus shortly because I'm already half an hour into this, but on Danielou and de Lubac's analysis of Origen. Origen is a much more famous figure than Marcion in the history of Christian thought, is also an heretic, but much more revered, so to speak, much more relied upon by successive authors from the 3rd century of the Christian era. In a book not very inspiredly titled Origin, Danielou goes continuously back and forth between an historical exposition and a religious justification for his interest in Origen. And by doing this explicitly, I think solves that problem of the bias of the observer. Danielou, instead of, as I think our field sometimes is guilty of doing, hiding the interest, whether it is political, religious, or methodological, behind the guise and the guile of simply looking at the historical fact, recognizes that in the choosing the target of our investigation, we're already making a choice that is political, religious, and ideological in nature. This, which to me has become one of the obsessions of my work, whether it is in the religious field, in the philosophical field, or even in the field of media, is in a way not a denial of the positionality of the researcher, but a claim about the possibility of having a positionality that is different from the methodology. Danielou doesn't, much like de Lubac after him, and I will get to him in a moment, they don't make a mystery of being not only Catholics, but Catholic intellectual involved in a discussion inside Catholicism about things like the spirit, the meaning of salvation, catharsis at the end of time, the goodness of God. So very theological themes, something that is usually taboo to our modern religious departments. But this disclosure doesn't mean for them to abandon or not to need the tools of historical analysis, and actually instead liberates them from this tension between the claim of absolute distantiation and the reality that the researcher is a person that, whether they are religious or not, whether they are politically involved or not, live in a world that is politically involved, that is religiously aligned or unaligned, that has undergone secularization or hasn't. And they present their research in a way that is not only accessible also by people who are not religious, but that becomes, in very secular France in circa 1950, they create an historical series of publication that becomes, with source chrétien, Christian sources, becomes the source not only for people who are interested in Christianity from a religious point of view, but even from atheist historians, from historians of language, from philology scholars. And so I think that in that recognizing that already in the choice of who we study, already in this choice of what our attention is turned to, something that I have been writing and researching upon over the last 5 years, the turn of attention to a specific subject is already an act of, if we want to be negative, bias, or if in a terminology that I prefer, an expression of our cultural density, an expression of our positionality in a culture that is complex and that contains religion much like it contains scientific point of views, ideological statements, political dimensions, etc. So origin is analyzed both as a protagonist of hermeneia, the biblical hermeneutics that is dear to Danielou, de Lubac, and von Balthasar, the three scholars that are in a dialogue about him, but also analyzed in terms of the historical dimension of his work. Both Danielou and de Lubac are often derailed in historical analyses that are not pertinent to the religious point, and even present sources and elements from origin that go against the defense of origin and their utilization of usage of origin to answer Christian political debate. De Lubac's work on origin, interesting, is titled Histoire et Esprit, History and Spirit. And much like the work by his colleagues inside Resourcement Theology, they are obsessed with this duality, with the fact that they are at the same time, and they claim to be at the same time, intellectuals, religious intellectuals involved in a religious, theological, confessional debate, and scholars at the same time. Again, while that's a tension that I do not feel, I am not involved in religious debate, I'm not active in a religious community, etc. I do think that the skepticism for those who are, and the illusion that simply not belonging to a religion or participating actively in a confession liberates us from the need to check our own perspective and somehow makes our historicity and our historical approach pure, is an illusion of the 20th century that recent years have proven to be just as naive as the 19th century Catholic approach of the only way to look at history is through faith. There is much more that could be said, but I'll go back to Voegelin, that was the inspiration for many of the Nouvelle Théologie theologians, that says that the course of history as a whole is no object of experience. History has no eidos because the course of history extends into the unknown future. Eidos is the Greek for what can be intuited. History is, by definition, an analysis that is constructed and starting with the investigator. And so while I am still a devotee of the historical approach, that's how I still approach the study of religion, from my research to even the tutorials with the students in the class. I think that the illusion that simply moving to an historical approach and leaving aside, so to speak, the philosophical, the religious, the confessional, the faith dimension of religion, far from being the non plus ultra and the rederationem of liberating us from our bias, risk hiding a bias that might not be confessional, but can certainly be ideological. In a last quote, which I try not to abuse of, but I really like, by Gadamer, one of my one of the most important philosophers in my work. History does not belong to us, but we belong to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leoni. So we'll take questions if people want to raise their hands using you'll see the icon for raising your hand on the toolbar, or you can type in the chat. If anyone would like to kick off discussion. James?
Thanks, Giacomo. That was really interesting. And you know, as a non-specialist on kind of early Christian history, to hear your kind of unpacking there of the way that Marcion and Origen have been approached by different schools of thought was really interesting. I listening to the presentation, I heard really two messages, not one. The one message relates to how we as scholars of religions today engage with our object of study and how we are reflexive in terms of our positionality. And you know, you didn't use the word political, but I would have, you know, said that they are political choices as well, in the broader sense. And the other then is how we relate to others who practice the historical method, whether they come from a theological, anthropological, whatever background they might come from. And I think they're not necessarily you know, dependent on each other. So in the field of study of religions, the kind of feminist critique of the study of religions does exactly what you said. It kind of brings into the mix, as well as others, it brings into the mix this this questioning of the positionality of the scholar, and that, you know, by declaring that you're non-confessional doesn't do enough work in terms of situating the person. And you know, I think it's largely due to feminist scholarship that we were challenged with that, but also from kind of anthropological field of anthropology as well. That questioning came in. The other sort of thrust behind the presentation was that, you know, as therefore, you know, as historians of religion, we should embrace the scholarship of those that declare themselves to have a confessional background, but nevertheless, you know, have an integrity of kind of inquiry that we should respect. I would say that, especially in the field of kind of early Christianity, and tell me if I'm wrong, that is the case. That many historians of Christianity, especially of early Christianity, who have, though, you know, kind of varied theological and non-theological backgrounds, work very well together and understand each other very well in relation to the work that they do. So really, my question is, do you see that as well? And should even though as kind of individual scholars of religion, we are constantly challenged to question, you know, our positionality in relation to our selection of objects of study, do you think, you know, what would the agenda for change be? Is there an agenda for change, or is it simply a question of, you know, inspiring us to be more self-critical in terms of positionality?
Well, just a quick, before answering the larger question, whether I see that to be true, yes, depending on the context. For example, Italy, I think, which compared to other fields, I think it still has a very strong academic production on the topic, still suffers from this drastical division that comes both from the academic and from the religious point of view, meaning that in a way, everything that has been, to use a catchphrase, because I don't think it's strictly correct, but let's say the theological dimension has been claimed by the Catholic Church. If you want to do studies about theology, even if you don't want to be a theologian yourself, you're expected to study at the seminar. And vice versa, the reaction has been that often religious studies department don't exist, and they are subsumed under history. All of my studies in ancient Christianity, history of Christian thought, etc., were completely and totally under the history facultà, the department, let's say. And I have seen that also in some countries and others. Vice versa, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, my experience in America has been almost the opposite. There is no religion department that doesn't have at least one class on theology, not only of Christian theology, but on the equivalent, although usually it doesn't go under the theology moniker for other religions. On the larger question, I think that we are progressing towards understanding that everyone has a positionality that is not not distinguishable, is not detachable from our work as researchers. I still think that we have recognized that and understood that in terms of groups that we belong to. I think there is still some progress to do in terms of the fact that even once we identify what group we belong to, nationality, gender, political affiliation, even faculty denomination, etc., there is still a sense of individuality that is hard to account for. One of the critiques beside the feminist one has been obviously the imperialist one, the anti-imperialist one, I would say, and something that American scholars in particular are very sensitive to. But still, that assumes that, say, an American scholar is a thing, right? Which is, in a way, an illusion, a construction, much like the Christian scholar or the Christian approach to the study of religion is a construction, where, as I hope I showed, two people can be Christian, can be scholars of religion, can be using the historical approach, and be in very different places in terms of how authentic they are in the declarations. So I think that while we have done a lot in terms of public and group positionality, group identity, recognizing, for example, that all of the people I mentioned, whether case studies, analysts, articles, were all men, all European, from Marchand on to Danielou. We have done a lot on that regard in terms of the group. We have not done as much in terms of recognizing the fact that we bring our own individual bias, even if, say, for example, my work in the US has always been from an outsider perspective. I am not only European, but not an English native speaker and all of that. But that part is often easily recognized. But I'm not the same that another male European, not English native speaker. And I think we are still a little behind on that.
Thanks, Giacomo. I have a follow-on question if there aren't any other questions, but I don't want to jump in case anybody else is kind of waiting.
Go ahead, James.
Yeah, that is more of a follow-on point, which relates to this, you know, the distinction between groups of people and the individual, because that's profoundly tied up with kind of systems of hegemony in different spheres, whether that's in, you know, the sort of academic sphere or in the kind of religious or the political. And so, you know, because of the nature way that social groups operate, and I think it's very difficult for members of hegemonic religious traditions to be individual voices with some of the freedoms that those that are members of other types of groupings. So it's a question of, you know, policing and control within those kind of institutional frameworks. At the university, it's another one of those, and we see the constant struggle and battles over, you know, the borders of freedom of speech and academic freedom and so on, regardless of whether we're thinking about theology, but they're compounded even more in relation to theological institutions. So I think it's even more complex than the way you present. but I mean, I think it's really valuable that we kind of interrogate those complexities, you know. As somebody, I realize I'm going on a bit now, but this is I find the conversation really fascinating, really important. As somebody that has tended to position themselves outside of a kind of a theological or a religious formation as a primary driver for research, as an individual, I think instead I've found that I've become situated within the historical political events of my lifetime. So it's actually, you know, changes in kind of geopolitics, borders and boundaries, kind of conflicts and conflict resolutions that have happened during one's lifetime that shape an agenda and shape those targets that you were talking about. That's kind of like, okay, where we look with our lens. So yeah, I just wonder, yeah, have you got anything to say on reflection of that kind of, you know, the kind of hegemony and power politics in institutions and the role of history itself, you know, as we are embedded in history as individuals?
Well, I strongly agree with this last formulation. To try and expand a little bit more, I think that, again, one of the things that I was trying to express in this presentation and elsewhere is that there is a certain naivete in the idea that religious belonging is the discrimination, the distinction between the actual researcher and the researcher that instead is participating in their life, in a way that is not done for what you just mentioned, the political and historical dimension of our lifetimes. For example, no one has ever objected to, in Italy, communist or anti-communist aligned intellectual talking about the history of Italy, including the history of Pope John Paul II, a famous anti-communist. But vice versa, there have been historians that have discounted the work of religious believers, Christians, on that because is the Pope of their own religion. While obviously in the experience of people a little older than myself, particularly, communism and anti-communism have been as crucial to the everyday and intellectual experience of people in Italy throughout the second half of the 20th century. People were being shot and condemned as terrorists or doing acts of terrorism in the name of communism and anti-communism, but apparently that's not influential. That doesn't shape your view of characters and historical events and books and theories, while whether you go to church or not apparently gives you the patent of good or bad scholar. And I find that, in a way, I think that, to me, it strikes me more as naive, although I also think that there is an intellectual danger in it. But to me, it is so blatantly unsound as a theory, this arbitrary distinction between religion as being the one thing that can make someone, I don't know, unsound researcher or something, as I have unfortunately heard, never to me, because again, I don't have a particular religious affiliation, but I have seen colleagues or public figures being considered not kosher, which is another religiously derived term, obviously, intellectuals because of their stated religious belief.
No, I mean, I'm just jumping in again. I don't see any other hands with Jenny, so you're moderating. It could end up as a conversation between me and Giacomo, which I don't want to happen. We can do that another time over coffee or something.
Well, there's still time if you want to come back in, James, but I was thinking, as you were speaking, Giacomo, when you mentioned like the political and the context of all different religious beliefs that we live in our lifetimes, and I'm just thinking of the field that I work in, Western esotericism and new religious movements. It's, I would say it's the opposite, where it seems, there's almost an assumption, at least historically, that people are Christian, or, when it comes to ethnographic research, I think it's very rarely asked of researchers who might be Christian, who are researching Christianity, what their own positionality is. Whereas when it comes to pagan studies or even historians of esotericism, their own practitioner status is very much questioned and sometimes used to try to undermine the field itself. So I think that's it's quite interesting how those dynamics work. But it's important to highlight, as you said, we're all, of course, influenced by the time we live in. We all have beliefs, whether or not that we would understand them as religious or not. And as I think Aman, we were having a similar conversation in a previous seminar, and I think Aman pointed out that even the term non-confessional that we use comes, of course, from the confession box. It's a Christian. We're kind of defining it against Christianity all the time, so it can be hard to find the words. Yeah, if you want to come back in, James, there's still time, or if anyone else has a question. I don't see any other hands up, so.
No, thanks, Jenny. That's a really interesting and important point you made there. But I would have to challenge that a little bit. As an ethnographer that works with Christian communities, it's the very first thing that you're asked. And I've done field work, amongst kind of Adventist communities, Baptists, who are very interested immediately in what your faith position is, but also more traditionalist.
Sorry, James, just to clarify, I meant other academics more than the community you're researching with, who might have their own agenda in trying to undermine the research somehow. So just to explain that.
No, thanks. But that you pointed to a really important tension, because the study of religions is this disparate set of this disparate field that's actually fed by historians of religion, ethnographers, scholars of, like you say, Western esotericism, new religious movements, all very, very divergent trends from different intellectual traditions that do sort of kind of occupy the same space in many academic departments and schools, and yet actually don't share the same assumptions in relation to their individual positionality in relation to their object of study. But it can be washed over, just like Giacomo said. I think that's the important thing, is the simplistic washing over of the fact that it is incredibly complex, even within a department that might describe itself as non-confessional, or just a study of religions as opposed to religious studies, or as opposed to theology, or something distinct. That there are far more distinctions to be unpacked than we have the simple language to do in kind of succinct ways. But just as a final word, because I've spoken a lot and Elizabeth's waiting to come in, thank you, Giacomo, for this. For the communism, anti-communism, it's really, really important, because it used it in relation to Italy, but that's a really, really important marker in East Central Europe in terms of the academic study of religions. And these very, very opposing kind of agendas that have emerged that have nothing to do with whether you have a religious affiliation or not, but it's whether you're considered to be, anti-communist, which means if you're anti-communist, then you look with a very strong sympathetic lens towards the suffering of communities during communism, but tend to ignore the suffering of communities during fascism, or whether you come from the opposing tradition, and it really has shaped the field, post 1990. But there's a great deal of denial about that, to the extent that some theologians and scholars have really say, oh, nothing changed from 1989 to 1991. Nothing's really changed to the academic study of religions. We still have the same theorists. We still have the same intellectual background that we're working with, ignoring this extreme kind of political event that actually kind of created the gulf between different communities of scholars. I'll stop there because yeah, I think Elizabeth's waiting to come in there.
Elizabeth?
Yes, this is just a really basic question, but it's something I've followed too, and I've noticed. I think we have a failure of language to cover the diversity of positions now. But James, I believe you use the term life world, and I'm wondering if we just have to move towards something like that, because we can't really say that anybody, like, it's on a really basic level, but everybody is political whether they're participating or not. In a way, like, maybe we're moving towards like not being able to distinguish in a clear way, and so maybe life world works better because everybody has the worldview. Just to throw that in there.
I am not particularly familiar with the discussion about life word. I'm reminded of Heideggerian studies on the sphere of the lived-in sphere and authentic talk versus idle talk and authentic self. But yeah, I tend to think in terms of contents that are accessible to us in my research. That's cultural density as the sum of accessible contents, because even when we speak about just leaving aside everything that we just said, the political influences, the religious influences, the biographical influences, even just as academic of the same, let's imagine two academics of the same exact subject, I don't know, two specialists on early Christianity or two specialists on 20th century neo-paganism and etc. Actually, we do not share the same identical cultural density. Not only because we have read different things, but because we have heard of different things. We might have forgotten something. Something can be quotable to one and completely alien to the other. Something is that one article that we are yet to read. The idea that there is such a thing as the abstract, detached and workable academic or intellectual per se, because obviously a lot of intellectual life happens outside academia, especially in the mass media age. I think it's crucial.
Brendan, question?
No, thanks, Jenny, and thank you, Giacomo. It's absolutely fascinating and a really important and interesting discussion for all of us who are engaged in study of religion scholarship. And there's so many dimensions to it. And I have a very short and brief question. Thinking particularly about the political dimensions to this, and studies of religions department are under pressure and are worried about being subsumed, and there's all kinds of things. But just in terms of doing the work, and I mean, I find myself with very many of those conundrums that you articulated so well in terms of how I approach my work. I'm just wondering what the solution is. Is reflexivity enough in terms of the individual scholar doing their work? What do you think?
Personally, and this needs obviously to be a very personal answer, I do think that that's not only enough, but all that there is there. It's interesting that on the political point, von Harnack was challenged by the next generation of scholars of the history of Christianity in Germany, specifically on the ground of his perceived neutrality. They said that the neutral scholar is a scholar that refuses to be engaged. They were trying to reclaim the role of history of religion for the theological perspective. Karl Barth is a theologian, he's not an historian. But it's interesting that we always think of the criticism from the academic system, but often society demands engagement for authenticity. In my work, whether it is in ethics or in religion, I always think that I exhaust my duties to my audience or to my students by disclosing clearly what my positionality is. The idea of exiting completely my positionality, I think, is naive to the point of becoming disingenuous. I cannot not be someone who has read these things and not others. I cannot not be someone who comes from a very privileged demographic in many different terms. And I don't think that there is any kind of process that I can do to divest completely myself of my perspective. I can only disclose it, be very transparent to myself and others of what my perspective is, which includes politics. I am never non-political in my work. I don't think there is anything that I write or read that is unpolitical, and I just try to be very transparent.
Yes, thank you very much.
Aman?
Hi, Giacomo. Thank you so much for that presentation. I was just sitting here thinking, self-reflecting on a lot of my approach in Islamic studies, and we've had these conversations. It's very difficult for Islamic studies scholars who are perceived as Muslim, who have brown skin, who look, and so I think there's a lot, not just on positionality, but actually connected to race, ethnicity, what your name sounds like, how people are immediately making kind of assumptions. But I think for me, if I was to kind of reflect on this, I've always used the approach that at times I will say, as a Muslim, when I was growing up, I went to the mosque in order to make a point, especially in a pedagogical scenario when I'm speaking to my students. But I will also very quickly take that Muslim hat off. And I will say to my students, for example, when we're talking about the Prophet Muhammad, we will say, I will get my students to say, put yourself in the shoes of a Muslim. How would they try to understand the Prophet? And then I will immediately say, now if we want to put on the academic critical hat, how do we understand the idea of revelation? That revelation came to the Prophet through an intermediary directly from God, or the idea that the Prophet married somebody who was very, very young. And then I say to them, put yourself into the position of a Muslim. Does a Muslim question the marriage to Aisha, who was between the ages 7 and 10? And how do we do that? And it takes me on to kind of critical approaches to the Quran, like, textual analysis of the Quran, Greek words that are found in the Quran, but also pushing students to think about it from a Muslim perspective, which is accepting the text verbatim as something. And I think what maybe, I cut a long story short, is that maybe what we need to do is it's weaving between these of, I find the idea of confessional, just as Jenny was saying, a lot of this is based on very Christian-centric approaches to looking at religious studies, and that is something that I've always kind of found it quite difficult in my own positionality, but maybe it is weaving through that. But I'm also going to throw a very, very kind of, I don't know if this is going to be a radical view, but I seem to find this obsession with non-confessional, non-theological, in those scholars who are Christian, who have some, either they're lapsed Christian, or they are Christian, or they are white. I don't know how to make sense of this more, but I seem to find this there's a very different way in which I'm seeing this amongst other scholars. But that was just the long and short of me trying to understand. But again, I think it's the continual center of for me, it is about challenge, it is about critique, it is about question, it is about what we do at a university, what we do in the academy, which is reflection, critical thinking, advancing knowledge. And I think that all of these labels, confessional, non-theological, I think they all fall at the wayside when we continually push ourselves towards this critical approach, which is furthering knowledge in some way. Thank you, Giacomo, for making us all think and making our department stronger. This is really, really important. And once again, we miss you. We really miss you.
Thank you. I think that you touch upon something that is very true, this obsession, in a way, misguided obsession with positionality, right? There is a good attention to positionality, and then there is an excessive attention to positionality that you just mentioned. I don't think it's by random chance that it happens in, as you said, people from a Christian background, people from a white identification, and as I mentioned before, America as well. I think it's a way of trying to deal with the history of hegemonic thought. How different groups react to that, I think, is a very, very large question. But I do notice that what you just mentioned of the taking off and on the religious hat is sometimes considered more hard than, say, taking on and off the Italian hat. Often in my discussion, especially on the political philosophy side, I mentioned that example that I mentioned before, that in the 70s, there was a significant part of Italian intellectuals that thought that terrorism, political terrorism, was a legitimate way to try and fight the authoritarian state. They were teaching universities, they were public intellectuals, were not underground networks of resistance, and they were declaring this in public on television and radio. And I often mention that I wonder, had I grown up in that university rather than 30 years later, what would have been of my ethical convictions. And then I moved to a more analytical analysis of Hobbes or of Foucault or whatever it is. And no one ever sees a problem with that movement, right? Of moving from the biographical experience of being Italian to the academic that looks at the history of Italy, looks at the history of political thought. Why would that be problematic instead if, say, I was Hindu and I was moving from the perspective of being Hindu to the perspective of the scholar? I don't know, but there is some of that, and it might be because I mostly move in those two environments and I don't move, say, in the linguistic environment, and maybe there is that there too, but I suspect that that's not the case. I don't know.
Thank you.
James?
Me again. So the discussion's taking a really interesting turn, and thanks, Anna, for pointing that out about the kind of intellectual trajectory of a kind of white, very Eurocentric American kind of approach to religion. But if we go back to that, the question of hegemonic kind of forces, hegemonic perspectives, in the history of the emergence of religious studies or study of religions, there was a very strong idea that that a space was needed to carve. They needed to carve out a space, and in order to carve out a space in a competing kind of academic environment, boundaries were necessary. Now it's. And in terms of kind of viewing things in that historical sense, looking back into the kind of intellectual tradition that emerged in the UK, for example, and how many scholars in the UK still feel that boundary is really, really important because they are situated in universities with a very strong kind of tradition of theology or founded by Christian traditions, and they are feel outnumbered and kind of that there is still work to do to defend a particular the legitimacy of a particular position. Now we as we're in a privileged position that we're not in that kind of a university environment where but we are in Ireland in the early 21st century, and we are in a state in which those that the hegemony of the Catholic Church is a very recent memory. So I think we should be reluctant to abandon some of the terminologies that were important to carve out that space before we have the kind of the, let's say, the comfort of a sort of an academic environment that has evolved from that position. So I mean, I just think in terms of the way that, I mean, when we're at international conferences, for example, and in this sense, Aman, you're absolutely right, that if you're non-white, if you're brown, if you're black from another, and there's an assumption that you belong to a particular religious tradition, whether it's a Sikh tradition or Islam, or indeed indigenous perspectives, that they are given legitimacy, and there's an expectation that they're present there in a way that they're not for the kind of the white middle class Anglo-American scholar. So we've got a lot of questioning to do in that context. But I think for the study of religions in Ireland, we have to always come back to the recent changes in Irish society that generated a trajectory or different trajectories in the academic study of religions that are still in formation. We have to start from where we are. That's always, I'm a pragmatist always, and I was like, okay, we can think how things should evolve in an ideal world and how we might express things, but we have to always remind ourselves, come back to something and say, well, we're in a particular environment in which we need to bring our students along with us. We need to bring the university with us, our colleagues. If we want to have a perspective on how polarized the view of kind of the theological and the non-theological are, I mean, we can just go and speak to our colleagues in sociology about how they see what we do. I mean, it's not always about our self-critique and our self-understanding. We have to factor in the perceptions of others. So our positionality is not carved out in relation to a kind of like navel gazing self-reflection. It's actually in relation to these other actors that are out there that are kind of influencing the way that we can and cannot position ourselves, with a certain language that's going to be comprehensible. It's going to create for us that space that's needed, rather than shutting it down. So I don't know if I didn't express that very clearly. So it was just a cry really for to not lose a sense of our own kind of historical positionality and geographical in our debates around what kind of language we can and can't use at the current moment.
Giacomo, if you want to respond, you can have the last word, because I realize we're over time.
Beside the fact that I wonder how long we could still say that we are in the early 21st century, because at some point we'll have to move to the middle. But I think that there are two things. One, that it's not new, right? This tension is not new. Kant writes The Conflict of the Faculty in the late 18th century. And also I think it's not limited, meaning that everyone is the maybe not scientific enough of someone else, right? The devotee is the not scientific enough of the atheist scholar, but the atheist sociologist is the not scientific enough of the engineer, and so forth and so on, right down to the joke that is not actually a joke of whether mathematics is a science, because it's constructed rather than observed, right? And so I think that the illusion of complete dominance of the factual truth, as I think came up during one of our conversation with the students, or about the conversation with the students, is only a matter of degree, right? For example, I was somewhat critical of von Harnack's historical approach, but that doesn't mean that I don't find his work on Marcion crucial. Brilliant and crucial. So recognizing the limits of objectivity in someone's work cannot go without also recognizing that complete objectivity is impossible, as we said before, and also that objectivity is not the end-all be-all of human knowledge. Human knowledge doesn't happen through absolute detachment from personal and physical experience, actually the opposite. The very source of the historical method is to rely on our measurable experiences rather than the abstract theory, right? And so I think that that's something that I still have a hard time internalizing, because like all of us, I did grow up in a post-Einstein, post-Kuhn world in which the idea of the modern science being objective is very strong in the public eye. But yeah, that I think that's not just a challenge for the religious department, although that's what I focus on because that's part of what I am, but of anyone who moves in a not yet, I would say, post-truth society.
So thank you so much, Giacomo, and thanks everyone for the discussion and for attending today.
Thanks, Giacomo.